Hello, everyone. Welcome to the BioBlitz Talks presented by the Whistler Naturalists. My name is Christina, and I am one of the volunteers at the Naturalists. I'd like to first acknowledge that, with gratitude, that the lands now known as Whistler lie in the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and the Lil'wat Nation. We respectfully honor their cultural practices and traditions. The Whistler Naturalists were a friendly group whose purpose is to increase knowledge of the natural world around Whistler and to share that knowledge with the community. There are lots of ways to get involved, and we welcome you to find out more about us on our website, whistlernaturalist.ca, and hopefully get to know some of you better. This year is our 15th annual BioBlitz, an event that introduces people to the real and fun science of nature and celebrates the amazing biodiversity surrounding us. To share knowledge, in addition to these talks tonight, this week, BioBlitz scientists are giving virtual presentations to the local schools on a variety of topics from fungi and ecology to birds and insects. And we are hoping to get back to in-person presentations next year. The hard science component of BioBlitz involves scientists scouring different ecosystems to increase our knowledge about the diversity of species in our area. In just 14 weekends of BioBlitz, spanning back to 2007, these experts have revealed at least 1,600 species not previously documented in Whistler. And we're now approaching similar numbers for the Pemberton count. This year, we plan to have the science component of BioBlitz happen at the end of July, and will include BioBlitzing in both alpine and old growth ecosystems. Among the direct benefits of BioBlitz, the work has contributed to the RMOW's biodiversity conservation initiatives, especially the conservation of species at risk. We'd like to thank the dozens of scientists who have donated their time over the years to make BioBlitz as successful as it has been. We couldn't run any of our BioBlitzes without financial support from the Whistler Community Foundation, and we are so grateful that they are as passionate about nature as we are. Also, thanks to Aware for being our charitable partner and for helping us with the technical aspects of this presentation. The Resort Municipality of Whistler is also a long-term supporter of BioBlitz, so thank you. So for tonight, for our BioBlitz Talks, we're so pleased to bring Dr. Rachel Holt together with local biologist and forest ecologist Bob Brett to discuss the state of old growth forests and forestry in BC and Whistler. Sabrina Hinnitz is also here to help with hosting, and you'll see her in a little while as well. And mentioning Sabrina, we wouldn't be here tonight without her. She's doing all the work behind the scenes, and so thank you, Sabrina. Bob Brett will present first and provide the local context about the state of old growth forests in Whistler. Then Rachel will present a provincial overview of BC's old growth forests, what is all the fuss about, and what happens now, followed by time for questions. If you do have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we will do our best to get them answered either during or after the presentations. I'll introduce Bob first, and then after that, Sabrina will introduce Rachel. So Bob Brett is a registered professional biologist and the founding president of the Whistler Naturalists. He has a master's in forest ecology from UBC and focused his research there on old forests. His tree core research on close to 1,000 trees produced Whistler's Old and Ancient Trees Guide, which was published by Aware. Bob also started the Whistler Biodiversity Project in 2004, which brought the known species in Whistler from just over 400 to over 4,300 species, with the list growing every year. It's a phenomenal project. Thanks to Bob, Whistler is at the forefront of biodiversity inventories across all of BC and likely Canada. So there is nobody who knows more about Whistler's natural environment, and all of us at the Whistler Naturalists are lucky to have Bob as a mentor. So Bob, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello. That's extremely nice of you, Christina. Thank you for that. So I will go directly to the slideshow and see what happens here. If you can tell me, Sabrina, in the share screen. There we go. Good. Okay. So as you can tell, I have a very broad subject here. Whistler's Old Forests, artwork courtesy of Chili Tom, and I am motivated and in awe of old forests. I'm sure that many of you are the same. Any time spent in old forests is an aesthetically and spiritually uplifting time. We'll talk a little bit about that, but mainly I'm going to be talking about the science of it. And I'm going to start with I just want to, for people who saw the Old Forest March talk, I'm going to retread some of it and then go into a little bit different tangent afterwards. So this part is about, like, how can you tell if you're in an old forest? And the it's, people think of big trees, and big trees isn't really the defining factor for old forests. It's old trees is more important, a more important metric. In our area, trees, forests below mid elevations that are over 250 years and above mid station, above older than 350 years are considered old growth by the province. And that means that pretty much any forest that hasn't been logged in Whistler is over 300 years, and therefore technically an old forest and definitely old growth. So it's really important to think of trees don't need to be large necessarily, they need to be large for the site. So if you have a rich site like the ancient cedars pictured here, you're going to get the big trees, and I'll show you some other examples shortly where that's not the same. So in an old forest, it's gone through various types of succession, where at some stage the original canopy trees, at least some of them, died and created spaces that allowed the light to get to the forest floor, which gives you this varying levels of luxuriousness on the forest floor of mosses and shrubs. And these are two examples from Waters Lake and Cheakamus Lake Trail. And the reason for the cheesy stars here is that I think that the biggest thing that differentiates old forests from managed second growth and third growth, etc., is the amount of decaying wood. These are standing dead trees, standing decaying trees, and then all the varying stages of decay on the forest floor. And these provide structural diversity and habitat niches for an enormous number of species. If you walk around in a forest in Whistler, you'll see it doesn't take much time to find trees with cavities in them. Cavities always sounds to me like a bad word because it brings me bad memories from the dentist, but these are essential habitat components in our old forest. The pileated woodpecker on the top left created all the cavities, or at least most of the cavities in this tree that you see in the middle. This is a live red cedar that's hollow, and you'll see if you ever see a big square hole in a tree, like a rectangular hole, square edges, those are foraging holes for pileated woodpecker. If you look at the top of that, if you see a very large round hole, that is probably a nest, past nest of a pileated woodpecker. We have a number of, they're called primary cavity excavators, birds that create these cavities. There's the biggest ones are pileated woodpeckers, of course. We have two other types of woodpeckers here, northern flicker and a couple of sapsucker species. that can create smaller cavities than that, and then even smaller cavities in particularly rotting wood can be excavated by chickadees and nuthatches, which always amazes me, such tiny birds. And as a result of these of this activity, we get cavity nesters that span a large variety of animals, from ducks and raptors, bats that also can live in the sloughing bark of old trees, along with brown creepers. Black bears can live in the cavities at the base of trees. Of course, they're not excavated, but they typically only occur in older forests. And martens, fishers, kind of medium-sized mammals like that can be in these cavities, as well as flying squirrels and bushy-tailed wood rats. So I will just blast through this because I want to spend more time later. But the main point is that old forests don't always look typically old forests like this one in Comfortably Numb, where it's a productive stand with big Douglas firs, and it's just a beautiful forest that most people would identify as old forest, even if it's not the huge giants of Vancouver Island. Especially in moisture forests that haven't seen fire for a long time, you also get forests like this. You'll see this from the Ascent Trail on Blackcomb. It's also around the Cadenwood area, uphill of the Cadenwood area. You get big western hemlocks where the Douglas firs have died out because there hasn't been a fire for a long time. And then, of course, the ancient cedars is the archetypal old forest in Whistler. You'll notice the Devil's Club on the forest floor, which is an indicator of moist, nutrient-rich sites, and often associated with red cedar, but here yellow cedar as well. And this has not burned for likely well over 1,000 years. The trees here are at least 750 and probably more years old. A very common forest type in Whistler are these dry forests that occur on rock outcrops like the Zen wetlands, emerald forest, emerald estates. These trees in the emerald forest are close to 400 years old. The ones in emerald estates, some of the very small Douglas firs are more like 600 years old. It's a very different looking forest, and maybe the epitome of that of these lodgepole pine forests that you see on the rock outcrops in emerald estates and the north end of Brandywine. And these are lodgepole pine forests that are much more common in the interior of British Columbia. These are the province considers these old growth at 140 years or older. These are at least 200 years old, and as you can see, they are very small, very slow growing, and this is old growth. And then finally, my favorite old growth are the snow forests that occur in the north-south valleys in Brandywine, Callahan, 21 Mile Creek, 19 Mile Creek. And the oldest trees in these, many of these stands approach or exceed 1,000 years old. The forests themselves could easily be 2 or 3 or 4 generations older than that. That is, they haven't burned. The forest is older than the trees that are standing there. And this sort of forest is vanishingly rare in the world, on the globe, and yet they are still under threat in British Columbia for logging. So, stealing the current motto, all of these, even though in spite of their different types of appearances, are worth more standing. So how can you tell if you're in a log forest? The obvious thing is stumps, and a really important thing when you're in Whistler, there's a lot of messy old logging, and messy old logging turns out to have been a good thing. If you look in the background there, you'll see some bigger stumps, and I'll just like around here. And these if you are short of big machinery, you're just going to find the logs that are easiest to get and worth the most to you. So in a lot of places, it's cedar high grading for building various things, and the rest of the forest was left behind. In contrast to that, stop annotating. So if you see on the left there, this to me is the wasteland of second growth forest. This, believe it or not, this is 60 years old, and I want to describe somebody, a friend of mine, this way: dense, dark, and simple. But I can't find anyone to describe that way. But as you can see, it's very unattractive, but it's to us, but it's also extremely unattractive to wildlife. It is extremely structurally simple. There are very few habitat niches. No light reaches the forest floor. And then on the right, you contrast that with an old growth stand that's structurally diverse. There's large pieces of wood on the forest floor. There's some saplings. There's different species and different sizes of canopy trees. And as I always say, I find these incredibly boring, and as I kind of mentioned there, it's also boring, that is uninteresting for most other species. It doesn't provide the habitat niches necessary. So this is why does it matter if we protect old growth forests? Just kind of going along with that, there are thousands of species that you find in an old growth forest. Some of which rely exclusively on old growth forests. They need a lot of old growth forests. They need unfragmented old forests, and they span every type of organism, from fungi to spiders and insects and lichens and mosses, snails and slugs, etc. So from a self-interest perspective, I'm going to go, I guess, counterclockwise from the top left here. There's a bunch of reasons why old forests are important standing, beyond ecological. One is slowing climate change. This is now called Tupper Lake. This is a lake that's formed in the last 30 years by the recession of Wedgemount Glacier. And by leaving the carbon in the woods in an old growth forest, we can slow climate change. Just below that, recreation and ecotourism. We know that there's more than $1 billion in tax revenue from tourism in Whistler, which dwarfs what would be yielded by logging in Whistler, especially of old growth. Fire resistance is greater in old forests as well. Typically, our subdivisions have been built into that dense second growth, but it's the old forests typically are more resilient to fire. And then finally, water quality and flow is better with old forests. Old forests regulate and clean the water. This isn't an issue for us. It's a big issue in lots of areas, in drier areas in the interior of BC and south into the States. I'm just going to quickly run over this example of a critical habitat that old growth provides for northern goshawks, which are an endangered bird, red listed. These are photos from Whistler, goshawk and eggs, and this nest. These are forest hunters, and I just want you to look at this from two lenses if possible. One from you are running a logging company, and one is you're looking for a home as a goshawk. And both of you will find this forest very attractive for mainly because of the number one here, which are the large wide space trees, which have high economic value, but that also provides the structure for goshawk habitat. Number two, in this image, these large trees have high canopies with large branches that provide nesting platforms for the large goshawk nests. Number three is that these are open forests that provide flyways to allow the goshawks to hunt and fly through them. Number four is the forest floor gives them access to prey like squirrels and mice and other small mammals. So one thing I would love to spend a ton of time on, but I'd rather listen to somebody else talk about it, is just about underground connections. And this is really in the news right now with mycorrhizal or fungal connections that link trees with other trees and with shrubs and other plants. And just as the schematic on the left here, each of those dots, the green dots, represents a tree. the bigger the dot, the bigger the tree, and you can see the linkages between them. This most highly connected tree on the bottom right, the so-called mother tree, is you just look at, it's pretty much connected with every other tree in that forest. And what's really cool about Suzanne Simard's work, who did this, is that the mother tree will share resources preferentially with its own offspring. So it can actually recognize and share resources with its genetically related trees. But what is also really interesting to me is that this represents a cooperative network, and very different than the kind of zero-sum competitive game that that forest professionals, foresters and loggers and the industry typically talks about. The idea here that Suzanne Simard says is that actually by keeping birch and alder and other species like that, the trees do better often. So this is a new book, Finding the Mother Tree. I recommend getting it. It just came out in April. It's fantastic. And another book that will be back in the library tomorrow, because I'm going to return it, is Entangled Life. If you want to learn about fungi and blow your mind and realize how important they are and how old forests are related, are important to maintain those fungal connections. I think it's really interesting stuff. And then as an aside, the two good-looking folks in the bottom right there, Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal, have actually been hired to act in the Hollywood movie on Finding the Mother Tree. So watch for that in your local cinemas or on Netflix. So this is what's everyone worked up about. I will not spend much time on this because this is what Rachel is talking about. Fairy Creek is in the news. The one of the last intact valleys on Vancouver Island with enormous trees. In Whistler, you've heard recently some people talking about 30 to 50% old growth in Whistler Valley, and of course it depends on where you put the boundaries. If you are looking at Whistler Valley, it's very clear to say that anything below this this line is, or pretty much everything below the line, not everything, is second growth and logged mainly 50 to 80 years ago. So we have a deficit of old forests at low elevations, especially. We should have much higher representation of old forests at low elevation to maintain ecological processes and the other non-logging values. More graphically, this is a little bit, I'd say a little bit sensationalistic, but I guess to the point, if you look at the Whistler Valley, follow the arrow to Whistler Valley here, sorry, Whistler Village, and all the red there shows what's been logged, or actually it includes urban development, obviously. And this is what's been logged 50 to 80 years ago. Over on the left here, the green is all the old forest. Anything that's green, or pretty much anything that's green, is over 300 years, and many are even 1,000 years and older. So there is skin in the game for us. We do want to maintain our old forest in Whistler. As we all say, if it can't happen in Whistler, it can't happen anywhere in British Columbia. And just finally, on this point, I think it's really important to note that when you remove an old growth forest, it's essentially gone. I mean, we don't really deal in 300, 400, or 500,000 year old timescales as humans. Think of where we were 300 or 500 years ago. You know, it's not realistic to consider sustainable old growth logging. That's just a point I'd like to make. Okay, so I sure would like to know how to unannotate. I might see if I can clear all drawings. Okay, there we go. So let's imagine a beautiful future where we've stopped old growth logging, and I actually am optimistic that we are getting closer than we have since the late 90s or late 80s, early 90s, and Clackwood and Carmana era. I think there's a good momentum, and there's so little old growth left that it's becoming more and more obvious all the time. So let's assume we've done that. What is next? And this is what interests me right now. So what is second growth management? How can we change our forest management so we just don't drive ourselves continually down with going back and clear cutting over and over until we end up with a sterile 35-year rotation kind of third growth, fourth growth. Just doesn't make sense if we want to be more enlightened about how we manage our forest. So the first thing is that it's the community forest itself is an artificial construct. If we were going to assess the whole land base within the community forest land area as mapped, which is a reasonable area, it is a landscape. We wouldn't start with an allowable cut or the logging as a given. We would talk about water quality, quality and flow. We would talk about recreation. We would talk about ecological process. We talk about wildlife habitat, and there may be some logging areas left after that. But we need to flip our planning on its head. We also need recruitment forests. So the first thing that you'll hear people talking about, if we can't log old growth forests, we need to go heavily into the second growth and go to the biggest, oldest second growth, because otherwise we can't make money. But those are also the teenagers of the forest ecosystem, that if we cut them, they will never become the adults and seniors on the forests of land base. They are how we are going to get back to representation of all ecosystem types in the valley. We can also do restoration forestry in Cadenwood kind of forests, where we go in there and remove some trees with the idea of creating the gaps that restarts the understory and starts to increase the structural and species diversity. There are jobs in that, by the way. And then if there is forestry, ecoforestry should be retaining the structural and species diversity as much as possible of the forests. And we're not doing that right now in British Columbia in general. And there are many ways that we can improve that are known, and we just haven't applied. And then finally, I think we have to recognize, and I think all of us do, that the First Nations are our partners in this, and they need our respect, of course. They deserve it, and they need economic and benefits and good jobs from the forest. And I think that I'm not the only one that thinks that can happen without this logging first focus. And then this is a challenge to all of us. I think that long term, I think the biggest risk to wildlife habitat anyway in our area is human use. Most recently, the naturalists were involved in the peak article on the Fitzsimmons spit, and how human use is causing all sorts of trouble with bird migration and breeding. We can use the Sprout example with the grizzlies as another one, and just the use of snowmobiles and ATVs getting farther and farther back. And I think that we need to figure out how to have no-go areas, lower impact on the forested land base and the alpine. And that's all of us. We need to. That's backcountry skiing, it's front country skiing. It's everything. How we can coexist with nature. Anyway, those are some of the things that I'm thinking of. I think that Rachel will give you the provincial context that will be really valuable, and I'm looking forward to hearing it. Finally, I already got the plug from Christina, but this map is available at Armchair and the museum, and you can also borrow it at the public library, and it's at the Aware booth at the farmers market. It just very quickly, there's about 40 areas that are easily accessible by walking or hiking, and there are still old forests that you can get to here. We're very lucky, and I recommend taking a look. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate that talk. Gave a really great context of the forest here in Whistler, I think, for everyone. I don't know if you can stop sharing your screen somehow. There we go. Thanks. But next up, we have Dr. Rachel Holt. We're very excited. She is a registered professional biologist, ecologist, trained in the science of conservation biology and land management, who spends her days working to apply science in the land and resource management context. Her areas of expertise include technical analysis of environmental conditions and trends, working with technical and negotiation teams to solve large and small scale conservation challenges, presenting and explaining complex issues to technical and lay audiences, and scientific development of management frameworks. She's been a member of multiple versions of provincial government, old growth working groups, and the cumulative effects team over the last 20 plus years. She's also been a member and vice chair of the Forest Practices Board. She recently co-authored a report entitled BC's Old Growth Forest, A Last Stand for Biodiversity with Dr. Karen Price and Dave Daust, and we're really looking forward to hearing her speak tonight. She's joining us from Nelson. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Hi there, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to join your session this evening. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Sinites, Ktunaxa, and Okanagan Nations peoples here in Nelson, where I've lived for the last 25 years. And I will share my screen and give a presentation. I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks. Okay, so I am going to give you a bit of a brief fly through the last. I'm going to give you a bit of a fly through something. We'll see once my computer will let me move on. Hopefully, any second now it will react. Apparently not. We're going to look at the title slide. All right, let me just. There we go. Okay. So there are many things I could have talked about. Forests themselves are super interesting. The whole social aspect of forests is super interesting. Sustainability issues, details on how all of this stuff works. There's lots of science involved. There's lots of provincial scale information, and there's lots of data. And in terms of knowing where to focus, I'm going to give a tiny snapshot of each of these things, hopefully. And part of the problem with managing forests is that the trees actually get lost. And so I'm just going to go over what are the issues, what are we trying to do about them, and what is actually happening. Hopefully I can shed some light on those things. So, I mean, just stepping back, Bob just gave a superb introduction of your local forests. Old forest is important for a whole variety of reasons. Inherent value, and then a whole pile of ecological, spiritual, cultural, and climate resilience and adaptation reasons. There are textbooks written on this. We don't pay a whole pile of attention to a lot of these things, but they're at risk. They're at risk because they're irreplaceable. As Bob said, they're not coming back when we've harvested them. We weren't going to let them come back, but now with climate change, they really aren't going to come back. And they're at risk because we log them. And that is how forest management works. We are going to harvest every tree that is not explicitly protected, that's on Crown land. And I think people don't really understand that and what that means. But unless it's protected, we're going to log it, and it's going to turn into second growth. That's the plan, and that's what we've been working on for the last 120 years. So the other reason old forest is important is because it's the one thing we manage in the province to actually maintain all the rest of our incredible biodiversity. And it's the key biodiversity strategy, and people don't understand that either. Our old growth management areas and our approach to managing old growth is supposed to maintain pretty much everything else. And so if we're not doing that well, then the losses extend far beyond just the forests themselves issues. And the other thing that should be so central to people's thoughts on forests is carbon. Forests are carbon. The ground that they're sitting in is carbon, huge amounts of carbon, carbon beyond the scales of thoughts on LNG or fossil fuels or cars or anything. The amount of carbon in forests is the thing driving the carbon cycle on the planet, and the thing that we need to really get our heads around managing. So, you know, we often see things that say we're going to plant 3 million trees or 3 billion trees, but it actually should be don't cut a tree. And the science says that harvest results in immediate loss of huge amounts of carbon. I have personally had the chief forester tell me that we need to harvest it before it burns. And we're told, don't worry, carbon will recover. We actually, believe it or not, do not account for forests in the global carbon accounting. So the Paris Agreement does not take into account forests. And that is a political decision that we are living with and dealing with now. And BC's new thing that they're doing is promoting massive scale sale of ancient and old forests, whole trees cut for pellet production, so that somewhere in Europe they can take a coal-fired power station offline, use our trees to go carbon neutral, and in British Columbia we put a massive amount of carbon into the sky. So we're doing that. The whole entire Fort Nelson TSA is lined up to be turned into pellets to go to Europe. So just a few messages: don't cut the big storage ecosystems. There's a huge amounts of science that says this really matters. We do not have time for forests to be carbon neutral. They would be carbon neutral over time, but we don't have, well, we don't have 10 years to wait, but we certainly don't have the 700 years to wait for them to become carbon neutral. And pellets are the next big scandal. So that was a tangent. I could have talked for hours on that, but so why now do we have this going on? 1993, we had Clackwot. Now we have Fairy Creek protests. We have seniors walking up hills, engaging in this. Why are we having this conversation again now? Well, to give the government, the current provincial government, a bit of credit, we are having this conversation really because it was coming, but they decided to ask this question. They decided to set up a panel to look at the state of old growth in BC. And as a result of that panel, I'm sure you're all aware of the Old Growth Strategic Review panel. And if you're not, you can go to the government website and look at the report. As a result of that, myself and my colleagues, Karen Price and Dave Daust, wrote this report. And what did we do? We did it, we looked at the condition of old forest across the ecosystem of British Columbia. And we broke down that analysis into productivity types in order to distinguish the very small from the medium from the tall forests. And we used a measure that they use in forestry called site index in order to do that. Why did we do it? Well, we did it because there was basically unhelpful or positively misinformation around the state of old growth, and a lack of clear public reporting. Both Karen and I have worked on old growth reports over the last 10 years, in fact longer, for the province, that never get released because they're not good news, so they don't actually ever surface. And the panel was struck, but with zero analytical support. They weren't given any information. So we thought that was not okay. So we did our own analysis. Just a quick rundown of the results of that. So this is a map of the province, and the green on it shows you the old forest as mapped using provincially available data. And it looks at all the trees. So site index is a measure of the productivity of a site. And the province, the government, says there's 13-ish million hectares of old growth, and we agree that that is true. When you look at all the trees, that is correct. But when you look at a slightly smaller subsample, so not all the trees, but slightly fewer, like slightly bigger trees, then you have fewer, less old growth. And when you look at even less, the even bigger trees, you have even less. And as you get into just looking at the big trees, you can see on the map, well, you can't see on the map because there isn't any green that you can really see. Very little old growth remains in the big forest types. So in the big tree type of old forest, less than 1%, that the big tree types of forest systems, less than 1% of the total forest in the province is old growth. And less than 3% of the total old growth in the province is the big tree stuff. And if I had a longer talk, I'd give you more information on that. And, you know, just to follow up in terms of what Bob was saying, it is true that it's not just big tree old growth that is important. All old growth provides values and ecosystem functions and all these other things, but there is a tendency, and it's true that there's some, you know, some dichotomy in the middle-sized trees in a sense, but more than 80% of the old forest in this province is really little treed stuff. It is forests on the outer coasts in the hypermaritime, bog forests, and it is high elevation forests, little treed forests in general. And so when the province says that there's 13.2 million hectares of old growth, they are equating these things as though they're the same. And although both are valuable, they're not the same. And one is significantly at risk and the other is much less at risk. I think I only have one graph in here and this is it. So I'm sorry about that. What this shows you along the bottom are all the different ecosystems in the province. So from the boreal white and black spruce here, coastal Douglas fir, coastal western hemlock, I won't go through them all. You basically have two of these groups in your area, the coastal western hemlock and the mountain hemlock. So these are your low elevation forests and these are your high elevation forests. And on that slide there, above each bar, there's this thing, and this little line tells you under natural conditions approximately how much of these forested ecosystems would be expected to be old under natural conditions. And you know, so for the wet types of forest in the coastal western hemlock, for instance, you would naturally expect more than 75% of the forest to be old. In most of the coastal western hemlock, the number is larger than that, but you know, it's up there. Same for your mountain hemlock. A very large amount of these forests naturally would have been old. So what we looked at, and you know, there's a lot of variability in the province. So some systems have much larger disturbance rates. So for instance, in the subboreal pine spruce zone, naturally you only have about a quarter of that landscape as old forest because it burns very frequently. So just to go back to this that I was saying, so if we just look here at the coastal western hemlock, each of these bars represents a different site index of forest. So the one on the left shows you all the forest, all the types of forest from the little to the big. And if you look at the whole total, we are getting close to, we have less than, but we are closer to natural in terms of how much old forest remains in that system. These are data for the whole province, so for the whole coast, all combined. But as we go along and look at the higher productive types, so as we get darker green here in each ecosystem, we are looking at the higher productive forests. You can see that across the board in all the ecosystems, that in the highest productivity types, you have very little old forest remaining. And that is what our analysis showed. And we did some other things too, but that is the key message that came out of our work. So there is a lot of old forest, but there is very little of the high productivity, big in general, in quotes, forests remaining, and that combining them into single metrics is completely inappropriate, and nobody should do it. So why are we here? Why are we in this state? Well, we're here because we have specifically got ourselves here. Old forest policy has, and I won't go through these things, but has largely was set in 1995 with the Biodiversity Guidebook, and has slowly been withered away over the last 25 years. And a whole bunch of it was not implemented in the first case, and bizarre things were implemented, like you can chop down old forest over much of the province and put a line around it and say that's your old growth management area, and you just have to wait 250 years for it to come back. We actually have that as part of the forest policy for old growth protection. It's called the drawdown policy. It's Orwellian, frankly, and people don't understand that that's how we're managing our old forests. We never implemented maintaining mature forests, so recruitment. We never managed for connectivity, which we were supposed to. We double count parks. But the prime thing we did was set timber supply caps, so which limited the impact on, it limits the impact of the policy on timber supply, but doesn't consider anything else. And so, we're in this mess, and we are seeing on our watch, in our ludicrously wealthy country, large species disappearing. My caribou that live outside my door here are gone. People say they winked out. I would say we drove them out. They have been extirpated locally, and most of the local herds of mountain caribou in the province are, if not gone, very, very close to gone. So we know something about the large species that are disappearing, but we do not know anything really about the hundreds and hundreds of little species that are disappearing as a result of these policies. And the key driver has been that timber supply has been the driving force. It is the thing we manage for, it's the thing we worry about, and we do not and have not assessed consequences for culture and ecological values. So we're here because we plan to be. And luckily, these two gentlemen, Al Gawley and Gary Merkel, who did the Old Growth Strategic Review report, said the same thing. I told them, so they just copied it. No, they said we have mismanaged our forests, and we need to change how we do that. And so they came up with 14 recommendations to change how we manage the forests. And the only two that I will just discuss here is that one was immediately defer harvest of at-risk old forest, and the second one was that we need a paradigm shift for how we're doing forest management. So they said this immediate response to ecosystems at very high risk. They basically said you cannot talk and log, so you need to stop harvesting the places that are most at risk while we figure out how to change management. That was more than a year ago that the report was handed to government, and in September of last year, the government made it available to the public, and we heard with great fanfare that the government had put 553,000 hectares of area aside to meet this criteria. And then they said, oh, sorry, it wasn't 353,000 because you actually can log all the stuff that's not old in those areas. So it's just 196,000. It took them probably 2 months to change the website and change their messaging on that particular point. And when we analyzed the data, I mean, it took us an afternoon to look at the information that they were providing. Only about less than 4,000 hectares of the total are actually the big types of forests that are at risk. And so it really didn't meet the criteria that was outlined in the report of the highest value forests. And the the other element that was interesting about those deferrals was that most of the total area was already deferred. It was actually not at risk at all because most of it was already off limits for some reason or other. I personally had worked on a few of those areas, setting them aside more than 10 years ago as part of an FSC certification. I know that most of the area that was identified in Clayoquot Sound was already, it was not at risk. And so, you know, there was a present and then there's a surprise. And the surprise was, well, you already got the present earlier. It's like getting a birthday present in October and then getting the same thing at Christmas and you're supposed to celebrate it. The minister has been asked to stop referring to these deferrals as high value, but has not yet stopped doing that. This is a op-ed from just last week. So, you know, government is noting that, yes, they need to do more, but it's very interesting to me that one of the key things that the panel said to do was to stop looking at the world through a timber supply lens. And yet it was very clear that the very first action was, in fact, to exactly look through a timber supply lens when they identified deferrals, because there was no timber supply impact associated with those areas. So that was not very hopeful. Today, if you've listened to the news, there is a new announcement around Fairy Creek deferral by the nations and signed off as an order in council by the provincial government. And I can't really speak to the details of that other than to say it is the next step. And I do believe the province intends to move forward more and take a more serious look at the deferral issue. I would only say that it needs to hurry up, because while all this conversation is going on, of course, harvesting is continuing. So locally, this is your area. You're all familiar with this map. I hope it shows up reasonably well here. Squamish, Whistler, Ilaho. I'm just going to show you some data things because I think it puts it in perspective, and it's kind of similar to what Bob did. But this is your old growth in your region, all the purple. What's the problem? There's no problem. Surely there's not a problem. That's a lot of purple. And now if I color it up in my little legend here, this is site index. And so the pinks are the low site index sites. And then as you go down into the greens, these are the higher productivity sites. So you can see an awful lot of pink and very little of the higher productivity old growth. And there certainly are patches that are notable on here. And so if I take off the pink and just look at site index greater than 15 or site index greater than 20, you can start to really drill in to where, in theory, using strategic level provincial data, where the best old growth sits. And, you know, I will say that Bob knows this much better than the data. And so, but what we're interested in is a provincial level conversation. And so you can use this kind of information to inform decision making. And it's really important for people to understand just how limited that productive old growth really is. You can also use other types of information. So for instance, this is a map of stand volume per tree, mapped for the whole province. And you can see some areas. So the green is the very lowest category. And then as you get, blue is the next, and purple is the next, and then yellow is in the top 5% of volume per tree. And if you think of volume per tree, you can think of that's a big tree. And it equates right to biomass. So we can think about carbon through this lens, and you can see the hotspots using this particular metric. this is another metric, and it just looks at tree height and measured in the same way. So again, the green, the coolest colors are the little stuff, and the blues are the next big, and then the pinks, and then the yellow again stands out as being the hotspots of the tallest trees. And we have been developing ways of mapping the forest using the provincial level data, using attributes like this to really try and look for the places where the best forests remain in the province. This, of course, if you take a step back and look at it, is what's been harvested already. So all the yellow is places that have been harvested, and the brown are burns. I don't think your most recent burn is on here, but so we can understand the landscape and look at the old growth in relation to the context of how we've impacted the whole land. And with that final click there, I just turned on private land. So we can see that at low elevation, we have a great deal of difficulty really managing for biodiversity values. And of course, at low elevation is where historically all the biodiversity values tended to be. I'm just flipping now to a map of the ecosystem types. And so your green is your coastal western hemlock, and then you've got a little narrow band of mountain hemlock, and then you basically have alpine ecosystems. And these are your parks. So if I just flip those back on and off, the brown again is the high elevation, as you're well aware, non-forested ecosystems largely. And we did an astonishing job of sticking a park over those ecosystems. So when people say that there is 15% or more protected areas in British Columbia, it's true, but more than 45% of them are high elevation, non-forested ecosystems. We have a very, very non-representative protected areas system in this province, as there is in the world. It is kind of astonishing, though, how they managed to actually skip practically all the trees when they laid out those parks. It was quite impressive, really. So we're using, my colleagues and I, Karen Price and Dave Daust, just released this map a couple of weeks ago, and it mapped, it's available on my website, it's with some other information. It mapped the best, largest forests in the province, in every ecosystem in the province. And we did that to try and kickstart the government into acting on this issue of deferrals, which it did. And this is what the map looks like for your region. And if we had more time, I would go into this, but basically you can start to parcel out the biggest areas by the top 1%, the top 3%, the top 10%. You can map the ancient forests, of which we know the data are very, very poor. Bob knows more ancient forests in your region than is shown in the strategic data. And that, of course, that kind of issue is going to become a problem as we go from trying to protect real trees on the ground, but using data that are strategic in nature and are often incorrect. But we certainly can do something with the information that we have. So deferrals, old growth, like stopping the logging so you can have a conversation, is really key to having a conversation, but it's not the goal. And we have to actually be really careful that we don't spend the next 5 years having that conversation. Instead, we need to get to this, which is the paradigm shift. It's what the Old Growth Strategic Review panel said we needed to do. We need to stop managing for timber. We need to shift to managing for ecosystem health and all these other things. And this is really key. And if we can actually embrace this, this will lead the path for doing many of the things that Bob talked about in an on-the-ground way. And so there really is a huge opportunity at this time to make that shift. of course, BC Timber Sales is still going with the fact that this letter was sent to company in Europe asking concerns about the state of old growth in the province. And they're still on the track of, well, there's loads of it, we don't need to worry. We're just going to keep going. Don't worry, buy the wood. So we do still have a lot of dots to connect in these conversations. And this is key. The timber supply review process is key to all of this. So if you're unfamiliar, the timber supply review process is how they set the amount of harvest that's possible in each region. And I could give an entire talk on this subject, but I won't. All I will say is that, well, we actually need a chief scientist. We have a chief forester, and the chief forester makes an awful lot of really important decisions. But we need a chief scientist, not somebody who is trained in the management of timber volume. We need somebody who's trained in data analysis and real contemplating sustainability issues. And the chief forester is directed by a letter from the minister that tells her, it's her right now, to not impact communities. So basically to not reduce the cut if you can help doing it. And so we need to shift that process. And this graphic just shows you that there is a massive gap in almost every timber supply area in the province between what is being harvested and what is the long-term sustainable yield. This is called the fall down. It means that this is what we're harvesting and this is what the long-term level is. That is just simply unsustainable. And this difference is usually old growth volume. Just to talk about what we've been doing for the last 20 years, this is the amount of harvest that we harvest every year. So for the last 20 years, we've averaged pretty much 71 million cubic meters a year over here, and that equates to a little over 200,000 hectares every year. And back in 1980, the chief forester warned that this was not sustainable, but we've managed to keep doing it, interestingly, over that time period. And however, the amount of jobs that we get over that same time period, and this is all federal data, has declined significantly. So the jobs per cubic meter have declined over time, and we get all the lowest jobs per cubic meter out of our forests of any province in Canada, as far as I understand, and certainly in a global sense, we are far below what other first world countries are doing in terms of how many jobs we're getting from this wood. So we're apparently embarking on a new approach, and we need to see a bunch of things to believe that that's true. We do need immediate deferrals of the most important forests. We need the people who make the decisions to actually start prioritizing ecological integrity and biodiversity, and we shouldn't have to wait for that. But as far as I can see, we're not seeing that at all currently. We've seen no action on that. And we need to change the rules. We need to change the law. Currently, it says in the law that you can manage for biodiversity without unduly impacting the timber supply of the province. So we can do that. We can look after the spotted owl. We can look after biodiversity. We can look after water, as long as it doesn't impact the timber supply. So unless we change the law, we literally can't do anything. We do need to overhaul timber supply review. And we need to, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is not simple. It's not easy to do. We should have done it 30 years ago, but we didn't. And now it's harder, just like managing for climate change is harder now than it would have been. But so we're going to need to fund this transition, but all of these things need to happen. And we manage for timber volume, but we do not manage for jobs. We don't say, don't let the jobs go down. Let's figure out how to actually employ people. That's not what we do. We just simply manage for timber volume, which is in the interests of a very, very limited subset of the population. So last week, there was a white paper put out by the government, an intentions paper. And last year, we had the old growth strategic review paper. And the two things, in theory, come together. And the intentions paper from last week, which was about changing tenure systems and potentially going to a more value-added industry, may well be a good thing. But it was criticized because it didn't link back to the old growth strategic review. And the thing that links these two things together is the allowable annual cut. It's how much we harvest. And the decisions whether the cut goes down, you cannot implement this without lowering the cut. And you could do this, you could deal with the intentions paper in terms of the industry while lowering the cut, but you have to actually work to do that. And all the data that I see the province putting out actually keeps saying that they're going to keep trying to push the cut even up further. And so this will be the key thing that holds our ability to do all these things together, and is the thing to watch and the thing to be talking to people about, because this is the key thing. If the cut does not come down, then nothing of substance is actually happening. And so we started here, and it's going on, and the people are coming off Fairy Creek potentially as of today, maybe not. The devil's in the details, which I won't go into too much, but I think that it's quite possible we may be seeing more of that over the next little while. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We're going to take some questions now. I'll bring Bob back because he might also be able to answer. And first up, we have someone with their hand up, well, two people. So I'm going to let Sean speak and ask her question first. Oh, Sean, can you type your question in the chat? I'm just going to move to the next person, Trisha, and see if it will work for their Zoom. Here you go, Trisha. You're able to speak. If you want to ask your question. Trisha, are you there?
Trisha, I think you need to unmute on your end as well.
Thanks. Thank you for that.
Sorry, I don't know. Can you hear?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
I'm 79 years old. I came to Canada in '67, and I worked in the Tassus sawmill up until 1971, off and on, as I was going through university and college. The Tassus sawmill has long since ceased to exist. It cut old growth Douglas fir. We cut trees where they had to put on hardwood saws to cut the Douglas fir old growth from the west coast of Vancouver Island. And it really was an education for me coming from Ireland to see this old growth forest disappearing. I said to the head sawyer, because he wanted me to train on the head rig, I said, it's all gone. When you fly out of here, you can't see any old growth anymore. He said, oh no, there's lots more out there. Don't worry about it. And, you know, it was a bunkhouse town, 300 young men from all over the world, smoked a lot of marijuana, did a lot of talking, and we all decided that there was a crisis and we wanted out of that game. And what they were doing was destructive. So basically, they were exporting logs, law logs. Every contract with Japan called for so many raw logs on top of huge cants. This was Doug fir, red cedar, yellow cedar, Sitka spruce. And those logs were sunk in lakes, freshwater lakes in Japan. And that is their emergency supply when war comes again. Now, I was telling this to a group of people about 30 years ago at the Ecology Center, and some women from the organization Women in Timber or something disagreed strongly and wanted my proof. And luckily, there was a lady from Denmark in the group who said, this is so true. My husband works for United Nations, and he was on a tour of the lakes in Japan where they sink the logs. And I almost went over and kissed the lady. I was so glad to see her. But are we still exporting raw logs? That's because
Yes.
that is.
Well, yes, we are. Much less than we did, for sure. Yeah. I don't think you can actually export. They have a grade limit on how much Douglas fir can be exported, but you can export raw logs, absolutely. But you know, we also think a finished product is a 2x4.
Yeah.
So you know, there was a very interesting Maclean's article that is worth looking up. That is from 1946 that talks about the extirpation of the Douglas fir old growth in 1946.
1946.
So you came after that, but it
Yes.
said, we set aside Cathedral Grove, and it wasn't even anywhere near the best forest.
No.
You know, that
it was a steep learning curve.
It's true.
For me.
But we have literally extirpated that ecosystem. It is gone.
That sawmill test is long gone. Jobs have gone. Yeah. And that whole timber supply area is being logged out on the west coast, around Nootka Island.
If I can add something here, our timber supply area, the Sioux timber supply area, is one of only 6 in the province that has a special dispensation to export raw logs or raw logs. So I don't know why.
Does that include yellow cedar and red cedar? That's so sick. It's just, I can see the Liberals going for it, but the NDP, it really chokes me up.
I have another question from Jane, who asks, I'm curious and worried about the Fort Nelson area. I saw a lot of valuable forests up there, but there are very few people who live in that corner of the province. Who is watching what is going on, and how can we get a good idea of issues that are in remote places?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly true. This particular issue has seen a fair amount of media because the largest pellet plant in British Columbia is going to be built there. So you can look it up on the Narwhal, or I believe Tyee had various articles on it. If you look up pellet plant Fort Nelson, it will come up. This is the kind of thing that the provincial government needs to hear very strongly, is not in the future of the direction they should be going, because you know, it is completely the wrong direction from the sense of increasing value. And they use the word waste because, you know, so for instance, in Washington, many schools have a biomass boiler, and they use waste, like actual waste, residual waste, to run systems. Revelstoke has one that they use their sawmill waste to heat the town. and the swimming pool, and that is great. So really using actual waste is real. But the thing that is coming for here in BC is harvesting whole trees and calling that waste because it's deciduous wood. And the other thing that's scary is the idea that we start to vacuum up the forest floor and actually take the waste wood that is in fact the stuff that keeps the forest alive and use it for biomass. So it's a very significant issue. There needs to be a massive pushback on biomass. Yes, and that is right. I see somebody saying that Mosi Hoda is the Drax lobbyist, and that is exactly right.
Okay. There's another question. Someone is wondering about how many different kinds of trees there are in BC. And is that relevant at all?
Well, I think there's 12 commercial tree species, and then there's a whole pile of other trees that between us we could probably list, but it would take us a while. I'm not sure off the top of my head.
I have another question here from the chat. As a co-op of loggers who worked with horses from Douglas Crook, as a co-op of loggers who worked with horses doing natural selection forestry here in the Cariboo, we found it was important to keep our selection criteria simple and defined, letting the forest, regardless of age, class, and timber type, define the candidates for removal as those trees dead or dying. Obviously, leaving necessary snag habitat and future coarse woody debris, we found it was very possible for many livelihoods in letting forests revive their opportunity for living through their succession revolutions. How can we propel these solutions forward?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. It's true. You know, Bob promoted Suzanne Simard's book, and she comes from a family of horse loggers as well, and talked a lot about this different approach. I mean, one of the recommendations in the panel report is that we ban clear cutting. And 25 years ago, there was a lot of effort put into looking at partial harvesting systems and how they can be used. And of course, if you go to partial harvesting, you need to lower the cut, otherwise you impact twice as much area, and that's problematic. But partial harvesting, you could maintain these mother trees, you could maintain cool water systems. And you know, the other element of the question, I mean, so that is one key change that needs to be embraced. And we have again forgotten how to do that. We kind of learned 25 years ago, and then we forgot again. We need to go back to that. The other thing that was just mentioned in that question was actually harvesting the profile of the forest. We do not do that. We have absolutely harvested the value out of the forest by going and picking the very biggest trees. And right now they use LiDAR to do exactly that, to just high grade at a very fine level the biggest trees. We're supposed to be harvesting the profile. The chief forester is supposed to check for that. We do not, and nobody checks. And so putting those kind of systems in place is again important.
If I may add, the small scale logging, like by the way, hi Doug, that Douglas is doing in the Cariboo is really challenging here because of the mountainside, similar to Nelson, I guess, where it's just really expensive to go into the woods. There isn't a road network, and it doesn't make sense to build a road network for a bunch of reasons. And so to take really, you'd need small scale logging equipment, like horse logging wouldn't work on those steeper slopes, but there's definitely kind of Swedish machines that will go into that habitat. But the challenge is that if we were truly going to log the profile, as Rachel says, and kind of be representative by ecosystem, the value proposition is not there if we're talking about no manufacturing. If we ship raw logs, it makes no sense. And so if we continue to act like a third world commodity producer, then I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah, but that is the key thing. So we have to monetize the forest in a completely different way, and I didn't really talk about that. You know, how much money does Whistler make out of tourism? Like we have to switch. You know, we have to make sure that we are either logging the profile or taking that stuff actually out of the cut. And we need to add the value proposition so that you can afford to do it right. And the challenging part is doing all of those things all at the same time. Like putting the pieces in place. There used to be log sort. I think Herb Hammond may have talked about that. There used to be log sorts. We don't do that anymore. I mean, it's crazy. We don't put the best log to the best use in this province, not even close to doing that. I mean, but the log sort systems closed down, and you know, we sent tenure off to the 5 major licensees and just changed the entire play. And so all of those things need to switch in order to turn this around.
There's another question for you, Rachel, from Claire. She said, you recognize the variability in the provincial age classification data set and the need to ground truth it, as Bob has been doing around Whistler. What is your understanding on the accuracy of the provincial forest age and location data?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's probably true that it's one of the best forest inventories in the world. Given the size of the province and the number of trees, it's pretty darn good in the strategic sense. So, but there are clear things here because it was designed to help harvest trees. It was not designed to do anything else other than that. So for instance, the age classes are generally good, but then we have age class 8 and age class 9, where age class 8 is forest 140 to 250 and then 250 plus. Usually, where trees are little, people tended to have said that they're age class 8. And where they were bigger, they tended to have said they were age class 9. So there is often really artificial things, and nobody has fixed that in the inventory because they didn't care. If it's older than this, I'm just going to log it. If I can get to it, I'm going to log it. It doesn't matter how old it is. So we haven't fixed that in the inventory. One of the criteria for in the old growth panel for immediate deferrals are ancient forests, and so you know, ancient is just a word for a really old forest. So choose your age cutoff. Usually it's something like greater than 500 years in wetter ecosystems. We have non-existent data on ancient forests. So a tiny proportion of forests are identified as ancient when in many ecosystems, particularly wet ecosystems, a much larger proportion of the old growth is actually very, very old. So it's not good at that kind of stuff. And it's not good at identifying different structure in the forest. The kind of two variety of stands that I showed, you can have a very small stunted cedar stand leading, and that's old, and a big cedar stand that is old, and they look the same in the data. And they don't totally look the same in the data because we have attributes that we don't usually use. And so that was the kind of thing that I was showing you to look at height and age class and diameter and height and volume class. And now I'm rambling into detail and I'll stop. It's not bad, but it's not good enough is really the answer to that. So we can use it at the strategic level to do broad stuff, but then we need to augment it. We will have areas that say that they're great when they're not, and we'll certainly have areas that don't say they're great when they are. And we need to figure out a way to get local engagement in forests and local mapping, so that when we get to the point of identifying the best stuff, we actually know what it is. And you know, there's kind of a scramble going on right now around the province trying to do that.
Rachel, may I just fill in something there? The locally, like the age classes don't mean anything except for log forests. The ages for log forests, which all of which are younger than 100 years, and almost all of which are younger than 80, are accurate. So anything that's not logged, you can assume is age class 9. And I was sorry, I'm not saying anything that you don't know, but like when the age classes were devised, they didn't expect to have old growth in the future. As late as the late 80s, the Forest Service explicitly expected to cut all old growth in the province. So it's not any surprise that they don't go beyond 250 years. But in our area, it sure would be nice if we can get to, you know, even 2 or 3 or 4 more age classes, because it does make a difference when it's over 400, over, you know, whatever the numbers, over 600, over 1,000, whatever the numbers are. Secondly, for the people watching, the oldest tree that we found so far in the Callahan, it was in the Callahan Valley near the ski jump, was in the middle of a marked logging road. It was going to be built. There's a logging road that was going to cut it on its way to other old growth. It was listed as age class 8, as in less than 250 years old. So it was only out by 1,000 years. And you know, that whole area. In fact, the mapping that you're using, Rachel, based on the provincial data, shows a lot of age class 8, and that matches exactly what you say. I can guarantee you that, well, out of 17 sites in the Callahan that we went to, there is no site where the oldest tree wasn't older than 500 years. So, and just one plea, if I can use my soapbox here, is that when you talk about best forests, and I understand why you're doing that, you and Dave and Karen, for immediate deferrals, to me, it's still talking about productivity. And to me, that it's, I'm glad to hear you talking about ancient forests. Actually, I haven't heard anyone talking about that in the province. But when it's not mapped properly, it's really hard to make that case. Absolutely,
it is a key criteria, and on that little map that I showed, all the area that is mapped as there's a very small amount that's mapped as ancient, and we've highlighted it, and it's probably ancient, but there's a whole bunch of other forest that's not mapped as ancient that is ancient, and we're just thinking about how to deal with that now.
Yeah, even within our community forest, they committed in 2012 to mapping the areas that I had as ancient, and it never ended up in their databases. There's still errors in what they show as in their age classes that they show for projected logging.
Well, thank you both so far. Maybe we just have time for one quick last question to hopefully leave us on a positive note. Just what can we do to move the government forward in the right direction?
Get your signs out. Use your voice. If you don't use your voice, you don't have a voice. The government has to know that the green vote matters in their party, to be frank. They are treading a fine line, and there's a lot of people. Speak to your MLAs, speak to other MLAs who are interested in this, and you people have to know that it's not just a bunch of hippies at Fairy Creek who care about this, and all the polling tells them that right now. But this is not a slow enterprise, and they're going to need to know that any leadership they do show is supported. So I think that, you know, be a little nuanced, and I think that is, yeah, you just use your voice and make it clear that these things are really important to you.
Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we'll take for tonight. To anyone who didn't get their question answered, you can feel free to send us the email at whistlernaturalist@gmail.com, and we will try and get an answer for you. I just wanted to do an extra special thank you to our guest speakers, Rachel and Bob. Both of your talks were fantastic and informative, and I'm sure it's given us a lot to digest and think about, and hopefully motivate everyone to take the action, because as you've mentioned, it's talk and log right now. We don't have a lot of time left. So as Rachel mentioned, write to your MLA. Here in the Sea to Sky, our MLA is Jordan Sturdy, a Liberal who he's got to hear from us, guys, because if he doesn't, then he won't know this is an important issue to us. So if you can email him, call him, schedule a meeting. And tomorrow there's a sign rally out front of his office at noon, which is, his office is, by the way, in Squamish at the Adventure Center there. So you can meet some like-minded people. It's not organized by the Whistler Naturalists, but I was just told about it in the chat, so I'm promoting it, and I hope people will take action and take your signs out there. And if Jordan Sturdy doesn't listen to us, then next election we all know who not to vote for, and hopefully we can make a better choice and vote for a candidate that does care. So I encourage everyone also to join the Whistler Naturalist community on Facebook, so we can keep this conversation going and work on solutions locally and more provincially wide, pool our resources together, and hopefully help put an end to old growth logging across the province once and for all. A recording of this will be up if anyone wants to watch it again or share it with your friends. I encourage you to. It'll be on Facebook right away, but also on the Whistler Naturalists website in a day or two. That's whistlernaturalist.ca. So thanks everyone again for participating, and really hope that this has inspired you to act to save old growth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.